They were not born human, and maybe that was the true beginning of the end. Imagine waking up in a world where giant creatures begin to appear in front of the cities. Huge, violent men, impossible to face. Beings that seemed to carry something wrong inside them, something that didn't belong on Earth. Now imagine discovering that they didn't just come from humanity, but of fallen angels. There is an old, short, and strange passage in Genesis 6:4, which for centuries has left scholars, religious people, and historians uneasy. A small verse, but disturbing, because he suggests that there was a time when celestial beings crossed a forbidden boundary, and the result of this union would have created the Nephilim, the giants. But there is one detail that almost no one notices. The Bible mentions this briefly, as if he was hiding something much bigger. But the Book of Enoch goes further, far beyond. It describes angels called watchers descending to earth, observing humans, and then making a decision that would change the world forever. Uma corrupção tão profunda que, segundo os antigos textos, a própria criação começou a entrar em colapso. And this is where it all gets weird, because the Nephilim weren't just big. Reports speak of insatiable hunger, extreme violence, forbidden knowledge, cities dominated by fear, entire peoples disappearing before creatures that seemed impossible to kill. The problem is that many ancient cultures around the world also talk about giants. Coincidence? Or fragmented memory of something that actually happened? What if the flood hadn't just been a punishment against common humanity? What if there was another reason, something so dangerous that it needed to be erased from Earth? Because the more you investigate the Nephilim, the more you realize that this story may never have been just a myth. And some believe that signs of that ancient corruption may still be here. At first, everything seemed like just a detail lost among the ancient texts. But then a question arises that completely changes the story. Who were the beings that descended from the heavens? The Book of Enoch calls these beings watchers, angels sent to observe humanity. They were supposed to watch, not interfere. That was the limit. But something happened. According to ancient reports, they began to look at humans differently, and what started as observation turned into desire, then into obsession. And this is where the narrative takes a disturbing turn. The Watchers didn't just abandon their heavenly position. They broke an order considered sacred. They descended to earth. They chose human women, and they made a pact among themselves that no one would go back, a pact of rebellion. But there is one detail that makes everything even more unsettling. These texts state that the angels did not just bring their presence. They brought forbidden knowledge. They taught weapons, war, manipulation, astrology, enchantments, techniques that, according to ancient writings, humanity should not yet know. And as this knowledge spread, something began to be born. The Nephilim, gigantes descritos como seres híbridos, not fully human, not entirely heavenly. And the more they grew, the more the world changed. Some reports claim that its size was frightening. Others say his strength seemed impossible. But what terrified people most was not just their appearance. It was the behavior. Unlimited violence, uncontrolled hunger, constant destruction, as if something inside them was completely corrupted. But then another question arises. If these beings really existed, why does the Bible say so little about them? Why does such a gigantic story appear in just a few verses? maybe because the details were too dangerous, or perhaps because remembering this meant accepting a frightening idea that there was a moment when heaven and earth mixed together, and the result almost destroyed the entire world. The ancients did not describe the Nephilim as mere giants. They spoke of them with fear, a real fear, as if they were trying to record something that should never have existed. In Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim appear linked to the sons of God and the sons of men. A short excerpt, but enough to raise questions that span thousands of years, because right after that, the texts say something strange. In those days, there were giants on the earth. In those days, and also afterwards. But who were these real beings? Some scholars believe that the name Nephilim could mean the fallen ones. Outros defendem que eram seres violentos que faziam os homens caírem diante deles. And that difference changes everything, because that would mean they weren't just huge creatures. They were living symbols of the corruption that had begun in the world. The Book of Enoch goes even deeper into this scenario. He describes the Nephilim as giants of absurd size, able to consume impossible amounts of food. E quando os recursos começaram a acabar, eles se voltaram contra os próprios humanos. And this is where the story gets dark. Ancient accounts speak of increasing violence, destroyed villages, people living in terror, as if the earth was slowly being taken over by something out of control. But there is another detail that is rarely mentioned. The Nephilim weren't just portrayed as strong. They seemed to carry an almost supernatural presence, as if they were living proof that a forbidden border had been crossed. And perhaps that's why so many ancient civilizations left similar stories. Sumerians, Greeks, ancient people from Mesopotamia. Many spoke of giants, demigods, or hybrid beings that existed before a great destruction. Coincidence? Or fragments of the same old memory? The problem is, the more you connect these stories, the harder it becomes to ignore a disturbing question. What if the Nephilim were more than a metaphor? Because the texts describe a world where humanity has begun to lose control of the earth itself. And at the center of it all were those giants, observing, dominating, growing up, as if something much bigger was brewing behind them. And perhaps the scariest thing is this: ancient authors wrote about the Nephilim not as a distant legend, but as a warning. At first, the Watchers seemed like silent observers, being sent to accompany humanity as it grew on earth. Mas alguma coisa mudou, and ancient texts treat this moment as a point of no return. The Book of Enoch describes a specific group of angels led by a figure called Semjaza. According to the story, they swore a secret oath before descending to earth. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a planned rebellion. They knew they were crossing a forbidden boundary, and they still went down. But the most disturbing thing was not just the union with human women. That's what came later, because the Watchers began to teach knowledge that, according to the texts, was hidden from humanity for a reason. Metallurgy for weapons, war techniques, handling of precious metals, astrology, enchantments, secrets linked to heaven and earth. And this is where everything starts to connect. Corruption didn't just happen physically, it happened mentally, spiritually, socially, as if the world is being accelerated towards something destructive. Old accounts state that violence escalated rapidly thereafter. People began to fight. Pride increased. The obsession with power spread. E no meio desse caos surgiram os Nephilim, cada vez maiores, mais violentos e difíceis de controlar. But there is a frightening detail in this process. The Watchers don't just appear as rebellious beings. They appear as transmitters of corruption, as if they had opened a door that should never have been opened. And the more humanity absorbed that knowledge, the further away it became from what it was before. The problem is that many see this story as just old fantasy, but the texts themselves treat this as a real contamination of the world, a rupture, as if the entire creation had begun to slowly deform. And then something even stranger happens. Reports say that the heavens observed human suffering. The cry of the earth would have reached God, because violence was no longer limited to a few regions. It was spreading everywhere. And the Nephilim seemed to be just the visible consequence of something much bigger going on behind the scenes. A corruption started by the Watchers, but now growing on its own, out of control. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this story so disturbing to this day, because it raises a question that is impossible to ignore. What if the real danger had never been just the giants, but the forbidden knowledge that came with them? The earth did not change all at once. She was changing little by little. First, perhaps, people heard rumors, stories of enormous men in distant regions, stories from frightened villages, families disappearing, screams in the night, deep marks on the floor, things that no one could explain properly. But then the rumors came closer. E quando chegaram perto, já não eram rumores. They were survivors talking. The ancient world began to realize that something had gotten out of control. The Nephilim weren't just a physical threat. They represented a break in the natural order. They were too big, too strong, too violent. And there was something worse. They were hungry, not just hunger for food, hunger for dominance, power, hunger to take up space in the world. The Book of Enoch describes this growth as an escalation of destruction. First, the giants consumed the earth's resources. Then, when nothing seemed enough, violence increased. What was once fear became panic. What was once alert turned to despair. And this is where everything changes. Because humanity wasn't just facing enemies. I was living inside a contaminated world. The Watchers' knowledge had spread war. The Nephilim spread terror. And corruption grew like a shadow, passing from city to city, from generation to generation, until no one seemed safe anymore. Can you imagine this? Looking at the horizon and not knowing if what's coming towards you is an army or something bigger than any man? And the most frightening thing is that, according to ancient texts, this violence has not stopped. It multiplied, as if every day made the world less human, more brutal, farther from God. Mas tem detalhe que quase ninguém percebe. Before the flood came as judgment, the earth already seemed to be sinking from within. It started with fear walking the earth. The fear of the Nephilim was not like the fear of an ordinary war. It was different, because in a war, you still imagine a chance of winning. But against them, the ancient people perhaps felt they had no chance at all. Imagine an entire village in silence at night, hearing heavy footsteps coming from far away. Nobody knows how many there are. Nobody knows where they are going. But everyone knows that if they arrive, nothing will be the same afterwards. And perhaps that was what made the Nephilim so terrifying. They didn't need to show up all the time. The mere possibility of them appearing changed everything. People slept in fear. They planted in fear. They raised their children in fear. The whole world seemed to live waiting for the next sign of destruction. But there is an even darker detail. The fear didn't just come from their size, it came from the feeling that those beings were wrong. As if creation itself was looking at them and saying, "This shouldn't exist." They were the living reminder of the Watcher's fall. Each giant was proof walking the earth that a celestial boundary had been broken, and that created a terror deeper than any violence. Because the problem wasn't just surviving the attack, it was understanding what that meant. If beings from the sky could fall, if they could corrupt the earth, if they could generate creatures like that, then how far could this corruption reach? And this is where the tension grows, because ancient texts suggest that humanity has begun to become accustomed to horror. Violence is no longer the exception. It became an environment. It became culture. It became routine. The world was getting hard, cold, brutal. E quando o medo vira rotina, algo morre dentro das pessoas. Hope diminishes. Faith weakens. Evil seems normal. Perhaps this was the most dangerous point. Not just the presence of the giants, but what they awakened in the world. And then the question arises that prepares everything for the next shock. When an entire land is gripped by fear, violence, and corruption, what remains to be saved? And then comes the part that changes everything. Because the flood does not appear in the narrative as ordinary rain. It appears as an answer, like judgment, como uma intervenção contra um mundo que tinha passado do limite. In Genesis, humanity's violence grows until it fills the earth. But when you look at the context of Genesis 6, you realize that the mention of the Nephilim comes close to this breakdown. It is not a detail thrown in by chance. It's as if the text were saying something happened before the waters. Something paved the way for destruction. The Book of Enoch makes this connection even more direct. It shows the earth crying out because of the violence of the giants. It shows the faithful angels bearing this suffering before God. It shows the watchers being tried. And it shows the Nephilim as a central part of the corruption that contaminated the ancient world. But there is one detail. The flood would not have been just to erase evil men. It would have been to stop a contamination that was growing too quickly. A prohibited mixture, unbridled violence, a knowledge that transformed humanity into something increasingly distant from its original purpose. And this is where the shock appears. If the Nephilim were children of the fallen watchers, then the flood can also be seen as a cleansing of the world after a spiritual invasion. Not just water against sin, but water against a corruption that had entered into creation. That's why Noah appears as a contrast. While the earth is gripped by violence, he is presented as someone preserved, separate, a point of continuity in a broken world. But the question is inevitable. What exactly was God preserving? Humanity? The lineage? The promise? Or all of this at the same time? Because if the corruption of the watchers had reached the entire world, then the flood was not just the end. It was a restart, an attempt to stop Earth from becoming completely unrecognizable. And there is still a phrase that bothers me from many people. In those days, there were giants on Earth, and also after, also later. What do you mean after? If the flood erased that ancient world, why does the idea of giants appear again later in other biblical accounts? This small opening creates a new mystery. Perhaps the flood ended an era. But perhaps it did not end all the shadows of that era. And that's exactly why this story remains so unsettling. What almost no one realizes is that the Nephilim are not just scary because of their size. They are frightening because of their meaning. Because if this story is read as just a legend about giants, it misses its most dangerous part. But when you look closely, you realize that the giants are just the surface. Behind them, there is a much deeper message. An order was broken. Heaven touched earth the wrong way, and the result was not a blessing. It was chaos. Perhaps this is why this narrative has survived for so long. Not because it just talks about huge creatures, but because it talks about an ancient fear that still exists today. The fear of exceeding limits that shouldn't be crossed. But there is one detail. Os vigilantes não caíram apenas porque desceram. They fell because they wanted to control what they should only observe. And that changes everything. The fall begins when vigilance becomes desire, when knowledge becomes power, when power becomes dominance, and when domination becomes destruction. Do you notice the pattern? The Nephilim were the visible result of an invisible corruption. And perhaps this is the central point that many miss. Before there was a giant walking the earth, there was already a fall happening within the angels themselves. Before violence dominated the world, there was already a secret decision being made. Before the waters arrived, the world was already broken inside, and this is where history stops seeming distant, because it points to an uncomfortable question. How many destructions start like this? Not with explosions, but with small limits being crossed, with hidden decisions, with desires fueled in silence, with knowledge used without wisdom. Perhaps the Nephilim were ancient monsters, but perhaps they were also a warning that all corruption, when it grows unchecked, ends up creating something greater than the culprits themselves can control. And then the question changes. It's not just who were the Nephilim. The deeper question is, what do they reveal about the world before the flood? And perhaps the answer is simple and scary. They reveal that that world was not just sinning, it was being taken. And perhaps that is why this story still reaches us today, because the Nephilim belong to the ancient world. But the question they leave is not in the past. What happens when a human being is given too much power, too quickly, without enough wisdom to carry that power? Think about it. The Watchers brought knowledge. Men received this knowledge. The giants were born in the midst of this rupture, and little by little, everything turned to strength, dominance, and fear. But has this pattern disappeared? Hoje, ninguém olha para o horizonte esperando ver gigantes caminhando entre montanhas. But the world still knows forces that grow beyond control, knowledge that promises advancement but can bring destruction, powers that begin as a solution and then become a threat. And this is where the ancient text seems to whisper something to the present. Perhaps the Nephilim are not just a reminder of what existed before the flood. Maybe they are a mirror, a warning about what happens when sacred boundaries are treated as small obstacles. Because every generation believes that it can control what it awakens. Every generation thinks it will be different. But the ancient accounts say something else. There are doors that, once opened, do not close easily. And when a civilization starts to play with what it doesn't understand, the danger doesn't always appear at the beginning. Sometimes it grows in silence until it gets too big to ignore. Perhaps this is what makes the Nephilim so disturbing. They are not just giants from the distant past. They are the image of a consequence. Proof that hidden choices can create public monsters. And if this happened once, the question remains: how many modern giants is the world creating without realizing it? And now we come to the most disturbing point of all. Because after all this, there is a feeling that is difficult to shake. This story doesn't really end. The Watchers have fallen, os Nephilim surgirum. The earth has been taken over by violence. The flood came. But the question remains open. Why do ancient texts still leave traces? Why does the Bible mention giants later? Why do so many cultures keep memories of huge, hybrid, powerful beings linked to ancient times and great catastrophes? Maybe because the world never completely forgets what that almost destroyed him? And maybe that's why Genesis 6 is so short. Not because it was unimportant, but because some stories seem small on the page and gigantic when you start to understand what they hide. But there is one final detail. The Nephilim are not just a biblical curiosity. They are a living question. A question about corruption, falling, pride, and broken boundaries. They force us to look at the past and ask, what really happened before the flood? And they also force us to look at the present and ask, what are we creating now without realizing it? Because every fall begins before it is seen. It starts with secrecy, in the hidden decision, in the desire to cross a border just one more time. And when it finally appears, it has already grown too much. Perhaps this is the true terror of the Nephilim, not the size, not force, not the legends, but the idea that the world can be slowly corrupted until it needs to be restarted. And if this story left you with questions, maybe that's exactly the point. Because the ancients did not write just to satisfy curiosity. They wrote to leave a warning about what comes down, about what is born, and about what grows when no one wants to see it. Now the question is with you. The Nephilim were just giants of the past, or signs that humanity always repeats the same forbidden limits. Comment what you believe, because perhaps the biggest mystery isn't the day the Nephilim appeared. Talvez seja descobrir-se de alguma forma they never left.